All right. So this week we're going through. We'll look at the Futato exercises from last week, but I want to start by looking at lesson 6 here and the verb, specifically the cow perfect conjugation of the verb. What we want to do here is distinguish between verbs and nouns. Okay, so let me fix something here. 1 second. I will be right back.
You are now muted.
You can take the car, period.
You are now unmuted.
All right, so looking at the nouns, one of the things that it talks about is gender for nouns. Nouns are either masculine or feminine. Now, just like anything in grammar, there are exceptions to this. For example, the noun ruach. Ruach is, let's put it this way. Sometimes ruach will take a masculine adjective. It'll be modified by a masculine adjective. Sometimes ruach, the word for breath, wind, or spirit, will be modified by a feminine adjective. Now there are some words that kind of have, maybe masculine or maybe feminine, but for the most part, 95, 96, 97% of Hebrew words will either be masculine or feminine. When they're masculine, they usually don't have any apparent ending to them in the singular. When they're feminine, they usually have a comet's hey ending to them in the singular. When they're in the plural, the masculine usually has a hirik yod mem ending to it. In the feminine, the plural usually has a holam vav tav ending to it. I'm saying usually on each of these because there are some weird exceptions to this. Words that are very basic, words that have been used forever, words that are some of the oldest words in Hebrew, tend to be irregular. They tend to not follow all of the rules because they've been around so long, people use them so much that sometimes they don't follow the rules. Okay, well, av is one of those. Av, as you can see, it doesn't have a comet's hey ending. This is a masculine noun, but when it goes into the feminine, when it goes into the plural, it looks feminine. It takes this feminine ending, right? You saw this in lesson 4. That doesn't mean the word is feminine. The word is still masculine. It's just an irregular plural. It takes this ending that is associated with feminine nouns. That doesn't make the noun feminine. It's still masculine. It for some weird reason, it takes this feminine looking ending. All right, same thing for ir, the word for city. This is a feminine noun. Okay? Now, it looks masculine in the singular because it doesn't end in a comet's hey. But again, this is just an irregularity. Okay? When this goes over into the plural, it has the hirik yod mem. So if you don't know the gender of ir, you might not think there's anything weird going on here. But this is actually a feminine singular and a feminine plural, even though they don't look feminine plural, feminine singular. These are exceptions, and when these exceptions occur in your vocabulary, Futato will point them out to you. So I guess they don't occur in this lesson, but when they occur, there will be a note about that. What I want you to understand from lesson 4 is this idea that nouns have gender and they have number, okay? And the spelling of these nouns will depend on their gender and number. If they are masculine plural, they'll usually end in a hirik yod mem. We see that here. If they're feminine and plural, they'll usually end in a holam vav tav. If they're masculine and singular, they'll often have no ending at all. If they're if they're feminine and singular, they'll usually have a comet's hey ending. All right. I'm reiterating all this to point out to you that there are two morphological features. There's a third one that we'll learn about later, but there are two morphological features that apply to every noun. And when I say morphological or morphology, that's talking about how the spelling changes. So there are two categories that will affect the spelling of a noun. That's what I mean by morphological. Those are number and gender. So number, you've got singular or plural, sometimes dual, and for gender you've got masculine and feminine. Well, when we get to verbs, we have all of a sudden more than just two factors that change the spelling of a verb. So when it comes to nouns, we have two. We have gender and number. But now that we're in verbs, we've got several other factors. We have pattern, which is what we're calling cal, and you'll learn more about what the pattern is later on. But basically, you can think of pattern as the type of action being described. So cal usually describes simple active action. All right, so active would be the boy hit the ball rather than the ball was hit. The ball was hit is passive. The boy hit the ball is active. Cal usually expresses simple active action. So you've got pattern. That's one thing that affects the morphology or the spelling of a verb. You've got conjugation, which right now we're learning perfect conjugation. So you got pattern, conjugation, and then you've also got person, gender, and number. All right, so nouns had gender and number. Those were two factors that affected the spelling of nouns, but the spelling of a verb is going to be affected by gender, number, pattern, conjugation, and person. And so it's very important to understand what these three other features are. Pattern, like we talked about, is the type of action. So cal pattern is simple active action. Conjugation usually has to do with aspect. Now, aspect is a category that is more of an intermediate type of discussion than an elementary discussion, but it's important to distinguish between what we usually think of as tense, which is related to the time that a verb is described as taking place, and aspect. Aspect isn't telling you necessarily when the action took place. It's portraying the action as either completed or not completed. When an action is portrayed as completed, we use the perfect conjugation in Hebrew. Okay, so that's what we're learning right now is the cal perfect. Since the perfect describes an action that's being portrayed as completed, it's most natural to translate this in the past tense in English, simple past tense. So halach means he walked. So again, if we're going to portray this action as completed, then we're going to use this, usually we're going to use the English past tense to do that. He walked. Later on, actually I think next semester probably, maybe the very end of this semester. Yeah, actually we'll get into it this semester. We'll learn about the imperfect conjugation. Well, if perfect describes an action as completed, then obviously imperfect would describe an action as not completed, which is why we usually translate the imperfect conjugation with the future and sometimes the present tense in English. So, not only is gender going to affect the spelling of a verb in Hebrew, for example, katal is masculine singular, katala is feminine singular in the third person. So here you've got a spelling difference because the gender has changed. Not only is number going to make a difference, so here we've got 3ms, third person masculine singular is katal, masculine plural which incidentally is the same as feminine plural. That's why we call it common plural, because the masculine and the feminine have the same form in the plural here. In the masculine singular, it's katal. In the plural, it's katalu. So there, number changes the spelling, just like it does for nouns. Gender and number affect the spelling. But in verbs, the person also affects the spelling. So third masculine singular is katal, but if I move this to the second person, instead of he killed, it's you killed. Well, now instead of katal, it's katalta. And actually it's katalta. We're going to accent the katalta. We're going to accent this syllable here. So you can see that the person, so third person, second person, first person, that's going to affect the spelling as well. So if you took a noun like Seuss, and you change the gender from masculine to feminine, and you change the number from singular to plural, you saw that there were actually 4 different spellings you could use for horse, depending on the gender and the number. And technically there were 5 if you include the dual, because the dual is the same in masculine and feminine. Well, when you get to verbs, there's not just 4 or 5 different spellings, there's actually 9 different spellings in the Cal Perfect, because we have different spellings for gender, number, so gender is masculine versus feminine, number is singular versus plural, and person, which is third, second, first. All of those factors change the spelling. So there's actually 9 different ways that we can spell killed in Hebrew, depending on what person it is, what gender it is, and what number it is. Now, just in case you're not quite refreshed on the idea of person when it comes to verbs, think of it this way. Imagine that 2 people are having a conversation. The person who's speaking is the first person in that conversation. So, when we're using first person pronouns, we say I and we, because the person speaking is the first person in that conversation. So, that person's going to use pronouns that refer to him or herself. So, first person is I or we. When it comes to verbs, that would be I killed or we killed. If those 2 people are having a conversation, the second person in that conversation is the person who's being spoken to, the person who's being addressed. So that's when we would say you. So when it comes to verbs, you killed. Now there's a feminine form of you killed, singular, and a masculine form of you killed, singular. The only difference is the kamatz under the tav here. Okay? And then when you get into the plural, the difference is the masculine has a mem, the feminine has a nun. But these are 4 different spellings for second person. Second person is the second person in the conversation, the person being addressed, the person being spoken to. In English, you. Okay? Third person is when the speaker refers to a third party that's not speaking or being spoken to. We refer to the person speaking as the first person. We refer to the person spoken to as the second person. And we refer to a third party who is neither speaking nor being spoken to in the third person. So that's how person works with regards to pronouns and verbs and that sort of a thing. All right. Couple things here. In this 6.10 paradigm, I want to make clear something that Futato is trying to point out to you. In lesson 5, we learned the personal pronouns. Now, when you learn those, it's probably a good idea to just memorize those personal pronouns as vocabulary words because you don't really have anything to base them on right now. But you learned um, either ani or sorry, no, you learned ani or anohi as I. You learned ata or at as you singular, masculine and feminine. You learned atem and attain or atena as you plural. Atem is masculine plural. Attain or atena is feminine plural. And then finally, in the third person, you learned who as he, masculine singular. You learned he as she, feminine singular. And then Haim and Haina, or sometimes Hain, those are your third person pronouns. I'm not sure why he left those pronouns out here in the third person because they would, I guess they, yeah, they're not too helpful right here yet. So what he wants you to see is if you can just memorize the third person pronouns, 3MS will be pretty easy. It's katal, it's the base form, it's the lexical form. And then to make this feminine singular, you just add the comets hey feminine singular ending. All of a sudden you've got the feminine version, just like you would for a noun. If you want to make it plural, well, whether it's masculine or feminine, instead of comets hey, just turn that comets hey into a shurik, and now it's plural. You will discover in Hebrew that shurik tends to be a sign of the plural. Actually, the vav in general, a vav suffix in general, tends to be a sign of third person, and the shurik tends to be a sign of the plural. All right, so that's third person. You kind of have to memorize those forms. But now let's look at second person. You'll notice the suffix for second person is the tav kametz. Well, the 2ms suffix tav kametz is the tav kametz that you see in the pronoun ata. So it's not like this is just a random suffix. The suffix is actually taken from the 2ms pronoun. So when you see that tav kametz, you should think the pronoun ata. Katal ta. Ata. Katal. If I wanted to say you killed, I could say katal ata, which would actually be like he killed, and then the subject you. But it's easier, instead of saying katal ata, to just say katal ta. But this tav kamet suffix here is taken from the 2ms pronoun that you've already learned. Same thing for second feminine. Instead of taking the tav kametz, 2fs pronoun is just ot, tav shaba. So we put the tav shaba ending, the tav shaba suffix on here, and in the verb we get the 2fs form. When you look at the 1cs, you've got ani or anohi, it's this hirik yod ending. Well, here we still have the tav to indicate that it's a perfect conjugation suffix, but we've got a hirik yod on the end. Okay? So you'll see similarities between the suffixes of the Cal Perfect and the personal pronouns that you've already learned. When we get into the plural, remember the pronoun was atem. Well, we just take that tem and we put it on the end of katal and we get katal tem, just like katal atem. Okay? So this would be you all, masculine, killed. Same for attain or atena. We take that tav noon and we put it on the end. So if you know your personal pronouns well, it's not too hard to learn this paradigm because most of the forms in this paradigm are borrowing their suffixes from the pronouns. The word for we, anachnu. Anachnu, we take the nu at the end, and we put it on katal, we get katalnu. All right? So you do have to memorize this paradigm. And honest to goodness, I mean, for this particular paradigm, I recommend memorizing not just the letters, but I recommend memorizing the vowels, the shavas, everything. Now, you may have better ways of memorizing this than I do. What I did when I was learning Hebrew was I just built a blank paradigm chart and I just filled it out. And every time I filled it out, I'd check myself, mark the things I got right, mark the things I got wrong, and then do it again, and then do it again, and then do it again. And it takes a while to really get it down that way, but I really got it down that way. When I learned, I was not taught that these endings came from the pronouns. So for me, it was pretty much straight memorization. But this should be a hint to you that, okay, because remember, the goal here in this class is not for you to learn how to compose Hebrew, which is what writing these paradigms out over and over and over again would do. That would teach you how to compose Hebrew. Your goal in this class is to learn how to recognize Hebrew and read Hebrew that's already been composed. So, a better exercise for your goal would be to give you a form and ask you to parse this form, rather than to give you a paradigm chart and ask you to fill in the chart. That latter example is compositional Hebrew. The former example, where you're given a form and you're asked to parse the form, that is recognition. That's what you're trying to learn in this class. So, maybe the better exercise for your goals in this class would be to just create a flashcard for each form. Write out each of these forms on one side of a flashcard, and then on the opposite side, write out the parsing, which I would include in that parsing Cal Perfect 1CP, Cal Perfect 2FP, Cal Perfect 2MP, and so on. Make sure that when you write this Hebrew word out that you've got everything precise. Every shavah, every dagesh, every vowel, every consonant, everything is exactly the way it's supposed to be, because you do not want to memorize these incorrectly. That will cause you all kinds of problems down the road. But this is sort of a non-negotiable. This might be the most important thing that you learn this semester is the CalPerfect conjugation. Okay? So there's really no shortcut here other than these suffixes are kind of clues if you remember what your pronouns were. All right, so that will help you with parsing. If you see a tem ending, that should remind you of the pronoun atem, which was 2mp. Okay, and so that should help you remember that, this katal tem is the 2mp form. But it's going to take time. It's going to take practice. This is not a place to cut corners. This is not a place to, try to catch up later. Don't get behind on this verb paradigm. If you get behind on, Hebrew sentences over here or even prepositions, you can catch up on that stuff. The adjective is important as well, but this stuff you can catch up on. Do not get behind this week. This week, lesson 6, you want to, if ever there were a week this semester for you to put your full 10 hours in, it would be this week. Memorize this paradigm, and it will save you a lot of headaches down the road. I'm not saying you're going to do it in one day. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, it's going to be quick. And when you get frustrated that you still haven't memorized it yet, when you get frustrated that you still don't get it, recognize it takes time, okay? You may still have difficulty with this chart after this week. That's okay, but put the time in. Because the only way to memorize this chart, this is a really helpful kind of piece of advice that I got on memorization. And it's counterintuitive. But the only way to memorize something is to forget it. When your brain is deciding what information to keep and what information to get rid of, when it's deciding how to filter that information, there are two things that, well, I'm sure there's more than two things, but two important factors in how your brain handles information is, one, frequency of recall. So if you review this once a week, your brain knows this isn't urgent enough for me to take up a lot of time memorizing right now. But if you review this chart twice a day, your brain realizes this is much more urgent information that you need to have quicker access to. So frequency of recall is a very important factor. Train your brain to realize that you're going to need this more than once a week. All right? So it needs to be better memorized. Now, that said, what you eventually want to do, because right now that's just telling your brain to keep it in short-term memory rather than forgetting it altogether. What you want to do is you want to get it into long-term memory, okay? So how do you get something from short-term memory to long-term memory? The counterintuitive part is, in order to get it from short-term memory to long-term memory, you have to forget it. Because your brain has to be corrected. When you look at something once, like a phone number, you might remember it for an hour, but eventually you're going to forget it. And the only way you're going to train your brain to put it in long-term memory is to wait, and not necessarily wait, but to allow yourself to forget it and then retrain your brain to remember it. That's what teaches your brain that short-term memory isn't good enough for this information. I've got to get it stored in my long-term memory. And so the only way that your brain realizes that short-term memory isn't enough is for your brain to let you forget the information, and then you encounter it again, and your brain's like, hey, I've seen this before. This is the second time I've needed it. Maybe this should go in long-term memory. All right. If there are any psychology majors or I don't know what the study of brain science is, but I'm sure that I have vastly oversimplified that. And probably what I'm saying is more anecdotal than scientific. The reason why I'm telling you this is because it really does take repetition and sort of spaced repetition in order to get this stuff into your long-term memory. The most important thing that I want to tell you about that is when you forget, when you miss it, our reaction is to be frustrated that we forgot it. I forgot it again. Okay? Don't look at that forgetting as a frustration. Look at that as an opportunity to get it into long-term memory. Okay? I know how frustrating it is to forget a vowel or to forget something about this chart. But that forgetting is an opportunity to train your brain to get this into long-term memory. That's only going to work if you do this if you review this every day, maybe twice a day, maybe 3 times a day, whatever's best for you. And I'll also tell you at a certain point, you don't want to just memorize writing these out. You don't want to just memorize reading them. The more senses you can get involved, the stronger that memory will be. So as you're reading through this, say it out loud. Don't just, read through it silently, but say it out loud. That will activate more of your memory. So when you go through this, pronounce these out loud and try to pronounce them to a certain rhythm or cadence that helps your memory as well. So as I go through here, this is the way I recite my CalPerfect paradigm with the verb katal. I'll recite it as katal, katala, katalta, katalt, katalti. Katalu, kataltem, kataltin, katalnu. Katal, katala, katalta, sorry. Katal, katala, katalta, katalt, katalti. That first one, that's singular, that's hard to get a rhythm for because the accent shifts so much in there. But katal, katala, katalta, katalt, katalti. Then in the plural, katalu, kataltem, katalten, katalnu. Right? Because all of these are um, three syllable. Well, it depends on how you count syllables, but uh, basically three vowels um, with the accent on the final one. So da 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 da. So that makes this easier. Katalu, kataltem, katalten, katalnu. These are trickier because you've got two syllables, three syllables, three syllables, three syllables, and the accent shifts around. So katal, katala, katalta, katalt, katalti. But if you can go through this with a rhythm, katal, katala, katalta, katalt, katalti, katalu, kataltem, katalten, katalnu. If you can kind of program that rhythm in your brain, that gives you one more sense to associate the memory with. All right. So, anyways, those are the most important things for me to sort of reiterate and cover for you on this lesson. Um, don't get discouraged when over the next couple weeks you forget some of this stuff. Don't give up. Um, Keep repeating it so that in 3 weeks and 4 weeks, you're over that hump of frustration. All right. Mo, did you have any other questions here about the CAL or anything more specific that you want to kind of discuss here? Any questions or anything like that? Because I want to make sure that we have a chance to discuss anything you have a question about.
So far, so good. I appreciate the.
I'm sorry, your mic was low there. I had trouble hearing you.
Thank you so much for giving us that hint that you
Yeah.
mentioned about pronouns and look at the end of the verb and the nouns to figure it out if it's singular or plural or different gender. I think that was a great point you mentioned. I'm going to use that. I
Yeah.
think it will save me a lot of time too. And now, Mr. Brusque, I don't have my book. I'm using my iPad here.
Yeah.
I don't have my book to look at that chart you mentioned that you were talking about pattern. And is there? I mean, is there a specific? I need to look at my book again. Is there a specific chart that I need to, you mentioned to memorize in it.
Right.
So is there any, which page I can find that, or is there, I'm afraid I will go to my logos and it will
Yeah.
just,
So in Futato, in lesson 6, the chart that you want to memorize is it's section 10, or sorry, it's section 6.10, and it's got the verbal form on the
okay.
leftmost column, and then the column just to the right of that will have in blue the sort of base form, the lexical form, the root letters, and then in black it will have the suffixes that go with the conjugation. And then the next column over to the right shows the pronouns where you can see the similarity between the pronoun and the suffix of the verb for that person, gender, number combination.
So I just need to memorize 610,
Yeah,
section 6.
610. Now, specifically, I would say the first column in 610. The rest of these columns are helpful in learning, but you only need to memorize one column, and that's the leftmost column, the first column in
First
610.
column.
Yeah, that's the one that you want to memorize.
Left column, that is the first column,
That's right.
section 610.
So I just realized that I'm giving this whole thing and I have not been sharing my screen. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to share my screen now, but the video that I'll post later of this conference, that will have my screen up the whole time. But let me go ahead and share that. I just realized that's why you're not able to see it. So now it's loading here. All right, so this column right here is the column that I'm referring to. That's the column you want to memorize. And then you can see over here that we've got the verb form, the root is in blue, and the suffixes are in black. But when you look at the black in this third column, you can see the connection between the 2ms form of the verb suffix and the 2ms pronoun. And the 2fs verb form and the 2fs pronoun. So that's what's so helpful about this chart here on 610.
I will do my best to memorize it.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. That's a big help. I think so far so good.
All right.
It's
Well,
that time.
let's take a look at these exercises here again. I'm not going to just go through every answer here. I'm just going to point out kind of what you need to be aware of. And
Okay.
that is, let me see if I can. Yeah, these are all going to be. These are all going to be predicative, which you would expect with personal pronouns, but we'll learn later that the third person pronoun can actually function in a different way. So here, basically what we're practicing is the idea that a pronoun plus a noun is often used in Hebrew to form a verbless clause. So this isn't just he father, this would be he is a father. Now you're not going to translate this as he is the father because there's no definite article, but he is a father. You are a father. A father am I, which in English you would still translate as I am a father. So in English, we're still going to put the subject first, even if Hebrew reverses the order. So that's pretty straightforward all the way down there. Now we look at the definite article, and then my guess is, actually, let me look at the assignment here. A, B, and F. Okay. So here, this is just practicing the definite article, which is what you learned last. Okay, that's why. All right, so let's look here. This is A. So B, we've got yom without the article is day or a day, but with the article, it's going to be the day. Now, actually, hayom is also how you say today in Hebrew, but you would go ahead and translate this for this lesson as the day. Elohim would be God or gods, but here Ha Elohim would be the gods. That's a bad example because there's some more advanced grammar that goes into this that I'm sure he doesn't want to get into. So I wouldn't have used this word as an example. But the next one, Habat, would be the house. Bot would just be house or a house. All right, so that's section B. And then F, this is kind of putting the two together. So we already did pronouns and we did definite articles. Now we're going to combine them. So here we've got Anochi Av, I, a father, I am a father. Ha'av, Anochi, I am the father. And then Atah Hamelech, you are the king. Hamilchama, she is the battle. Okay, well that doesn't make any sense. That's because here we've got the third person pronoun.
It is a battle. It is the
Yeah,
war.
yeah. In English, it is the battle or it is the war. The reason why it's feminine is because milchama is feminine. All right, so that's why we use a gendered pronoun here. Number 5, Hena susot, they are horses. Now, has he talked about? I would actually translate that as those are horses, but that's a demonstrative, and I don't think he brings that in yet. Yeah, so ignore me. That won't come in until lesson 17. So you don't need to worry about that.
Rusky, I have a
Yep.
quick question for number 5.
Uh-huh.
Um, I wrote, they are mayors.
Yeah, perfect.
Do you think is
Yeah, that's a good way to translate it. Mare is just the word for a female horse. It's a less common word in English today than it used to be. So most people would refer to a group of horses as horses, whether they were mares or not. So they are horses or they are mares. Both of those are fine. It's preferable actually to say they are mares because that shows me you know it's feminine. But I would accept they are horses just because mares is a less common word in English than horses are, obviously. So that's everything. The rest of section F, that's basically just following the same pattern there. So unless there's anything else you want to go through, we'll go ahead and wrap it up.